A young man rescues a CEO in danger and wins her heart, transforming both of their destinies. The deafening sound of the siren cut through the freezing Boston air as Blake Turner maneuvered the ambulance through the congested streets of the financial district. The red and blue lights reflected off the glazed skyscrapers, creating a chaotic spectacle that he barely noticed after 7 years as a paramedic. The call was high priority. Multiple accident on Boylston Street, involving 3 vehicles and possible victims trapped in the wreckage. Unit 47 arriving in 2 minutes. Blake reported over the radio, his blue eyes fixed on the road ahead as his partner, Monica Rodriguez, checked the equipment for the 3rd time, a habit he admired in her. The scene they found was even worse than expected. A luxury SUV was practically split in half after being hit by a truck that had apparently lost its brakes. A 3rd vehicle had been dragged along in the process, completing the scene of destruction. Blake jumped out of the ambulance, gear in hand, and ran towards the SUV. Shattered glass sparkled on the asphalt like diamonds in the late afternoon sun. A woman was trapped in the driver's seat, unconscious, her elegant business suit stained with blood. The airbag had deployed, but the impact had been brutal. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" Blake checked her vital signs while Monica coordinated with the firefighters on the best way to carry out the rescue. The woman had a pulse, but it was weak and irregular. Her pupils reacted to light, a good sign. Alexander Sterling, 36, Monica reported, reading the wallet found on the console. CEO of Sterling Pharmaceuticals. Blake had no time to be impressed by the victim's status. His years of experience had taught him that, beneath the blood and wounds, everyone was equally human, equally fragile. He began to apply the protocol he had developed over the last few years, a specific sequence of procedures that he had refined after hundreds of visits. Initiating Turner protocol, he murmured, more to himself than to Monica, who was already well acquainted with his unorthodox methodology. It was an approach that combined conventional techniques with innovations he had developed based on his practical experience. The next few minutes were a synchronized ballet of precise actions. Blake stabilized Alexander's neck, monitored her vital signs, and applied the necessary procedures while the firefighters worked to free her from the wreckage. His mind was focused, his hands steady, executing each movement with the precision of a surgeon. "Blake, the pressure's dropping," Monica warned. "Not today," he muttered, quickly adjusting his approach. The Turner protocol had a flexibility that standard procedures didn't, allowing for rapid adaptations based on the patient's responses. When they finally managed to get Alexandra out of the vehicle, Blake continued the care all the way to Massachusetts General Hospital. On the way, she briefly regained consciousness. "Stay calm, Mrs. Sterling. Everything is under control," he assured her, meeting her disoriented green eyes. "I'm Blake, a paramedic, and we're taking you to the hospital." "My presentation," she mumbled, trying to move. "The only presentation that matters now is your vital signs, and they're improving," Blake replied with a reassuring smile, unconsciously admiring the strength of this woman who, even in critical condition, cared about professional commitments. At the hospital, Blake passed the case onto the trauma team, detailing every procedure performed. Dr. Marcus Chun, head of the emergency department, listened with special attention. "Your protocol saved another one, Turner," the doctor commented, after Alexandra had been referred for surgery. "You really should document that." Blake just shrugged, as he always did when someone mentioned his method. "I'm just doing my job, doctor." Back in the ambulance, preparing for another call, Blake couldn't have imagined that this rescue would change his life. He didn't know that Alexander Sterling, as well as being one of Boston's most influential executives, was known for turning promising ideas into global successes. And she certainly didn't imagine that over the next few weeks, as she recovered, her interest in the protocol that had saved her life would turn into something much greater. Monica watched her partner with a knowing smile. "You know, Blake, one day someone will realize how revolutionary your method is." "It's just common sense and experience, Monica," he replied, organizing his equipment. "It's more than that, and you know it," she insisted. "You've combined techniques in a way that no one has thought of before. Why don't you document it?" Blake hesitated, remembering the numerous notebooks in his apartment, full of notes and observations collected over the years. "Maybe one day," he replied vaguely, as a new call came over the radio. The night wore on, and with it more lives to be saved. Blake didn't know it, but his maybe one day was closer than he imagined, and Alexander Sterling would be the catalyst for that change. Fate had intertwined their paths in a way that neither of them could have foreseen, and the consequences of this encounter would be far more profound than a simple rescue. The siren sounded again, and Blake plunged back into the frenetic routine of emergencies that was his life. But something had changed that day. A seed had been planted, and soon it would begin to bear fruit that would transform not only their lives, but the future of emergency care around the world. Alexander Sterling opened her eyes slowly, the fluorescent light of the hospital room invading her consciousness along with the rhythmic sound of the heart monitors. Memories of the accident came to her in fragments. The speeding truck, the violent impact, and a pair of reassuring blue eyes in the midst of the chaos. "Welcome back," said Dr. Chen, approaching the bed. "You are very lucky. The paramedic who attended to you, well, let's just say he has a special gift." Alexandra tried to adjust herself on the bed, feeling every muscle in her body protest. "Blake," she mumbled, remembering his name. "He told me his name in the ambulance." "Blake Turner," confirmed Dr. Chen, checking his vital signs. "He developed his own care protocol that has saved lives that, frankly, other conventional protocols would have missed, including yours." As CEO of Sterling Pharmaceuticals, Alexandra was used to recognizing innovation when she saw it. Her professional interest was instantly piqued. "Tell me more about this protocol," she asked, momentarily ignoring the pain in her ribs. "Unfortunately, there is no official documentation," Dr. Chen explained. "Blake keeps everything in personal notebooks. Several of us have tried to convince him to publish his method, but he refuses," Alexander added, recognizing the profile. Throughout her career, she had met many reluctant geniuses, brilliant people who created extraordinary innovations but hesitated to share them with the world. In the days that followed, Alexander took advantage of her recovery to research Blake Turner. She discovered that he had a significantly higher than average patient survival rate, especially in critical cases. Her detailed notes revealed impressive figures: 27% higher chances of survival in severe trauma when compared to standard protocols. A week after the accident, she received an unexpected visit. Blake was standing in the doorway of her room, still wearing his paramedic uniform, apparently having been there between calls. "Mrs. Sterling," he greeted hesitantly. "I just wanted to check how you're recovering." Alexandra watched him with new eyes. He wasn't just the paramedic who had saved her, but an innovator who could revolutionize emergency care on a global scale. "Please call me Alexandra," she replied, indicating the chair next to the bed. "And since you're here, I'd like to discuss something with you." Blake sat down intrigued. Alexander Sterling was known in the corporate world for her ability to identify and develop promising innovations. Her instinct for business had transformed Sterling Pharmaceuticals from a family business into an industry powerhouse in just 5 years. "Your protocol," she began, straight to the point. "I want to help turn it into a global standard of care." Blake shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "It's just a series of practical observations, which saved my life," Alexander interrupted, "and could save thousands of others." "Dr. Chen showed me the statistics, Blake. What you developed is revolutionary." "I don't know if I'm ready for all this exposure," he admitted, running a hand through his dark hair in a nervous gesture. Alexander smiled, understanding. "I wasn't ready to take over a company at 31 either, after my father's sudden death. Sometimes life pushes us in unexpected directions." The conversation was interrupted by Blake's radio, another emergency call. He stood up quickly, but Alexander grabbed his arm. "Think about it," she urged. "Not as a business opportunity, but as a chance to multiply the good you already do. How many lives could be saved if every paramedic had access to your knowledge?" Blake nodded briefly before running off. Alexandra watched him go, recognizing in him the same passion for his work that drove her. The difference was that she had learned to turn passion into measurable impact. Over the next few days, as she recovered, Alexandra began to mentally structure how she could turn the Turner Protocol into a replicable methodology. Her company had the resources, connections, and infrastructure needed to implement large-scale change. One afternoon, while reviewing some documents from the work her assistant had brought in, Alexandra received another visit from Blake. This time, he was carrying a worn box full of notebooks. "These are all my notes from the last 7 years," he explained, placing the box on the table next to the bed. "Every case, every adaptation, every observation about what worked and what didn't." Alexander flipped through one of the notebooks, impressed by the level of detail. "What changed your mind?" "I had a call yesterday," Blake replied, sitting down. "A 12-year-old girl, bicycle accident. I used a protocol, she survived. But I wondered, what if the paramedic who attended her didn't know these techniques? What if she wasn't as lucky as I was to have you around?" Alexander added softly. Blake nodded, his eyes revealing a mixture of determination and vulnerability. "I can't keep that to myself. It's not fair." Alexander smiled, reaching out to take his hand. The touch was brief, professional, but laden with promise. "Let's do this together then. Turn your knowledge into something that can train emergency teams all over the country, maybe even internationally." "Where do we start?" Blake asked, and Alexandra felt her heart racing. This time not from the drugs, but from the excitement of a new challenge, a new mission. What neither of them realized at that moment was that this professional partnership would only be the beginning of a much deeper journey. As they discussed the next steps, something subtle began to develop between them, a connection that transcended their different backgrounds and life experiences. The meeting room on the 40th floor of Sterling Pharmaceuticals emanated power. Alexandra adjusted her posture in the leather chair, ignoring the slight discomfort she still felt from her recovering ribs. In front of her, the company's board of directors awaited her presentation on the new project she had insisted on leading personally. Blake was sitting next to her, visibly uncomfortable in his borrowed suit, a drastic change from the paramedic's uniform he was used to. His hands firmly held a folder containing years of research meticulously organized by Alexander's team over the last 2 weeks. "Gentlemen," Alexander began, her firm voice echoing through the room, "3 weeks ago, I should have been dead. The fact that I am here today is due not only to traditional medical expertise, but to an innovation that has the potential to revolutionize emergency care globally." The next 2 hours were dedicated to a detailed presentation of the Turner Protocol. Blake watched in amazement as Alexandra transformed her handwritten notes into compelling data, impressive statistics, and impact projections that made even the most skeptical directors lean forward in their chairs. "With proper implementation," Alexander concluded, "we can reduce mortality in emergency care by up to 27%. That means thousands of lives saved every year in the United States alone." Richard Keller, the CFO, adjusted his glasses. "What about the investment required?" "Less than we spent last year on developing the antibiotic that hasn't yet been approved by the FDA," Alexander answered promptly. "With a significantly higher potential return, not just financially, but in social impact." When the meeting ended, approval was unanimous. In the elevator, going down to the lobby, Blake finally let out the breath he hadn't even realized he was holding. "You were amazing in there," he commented, loosening his tie. "You turned my chaotic notes into something real?" Alexander added, smiling. "Blake, it was always real. It just needed the right structure to reach its full potential." Leaving the building, they walked to a nearby cafe, a ritual they had developed over the last few weeks of working together. The contrast between them was evident. Alexandra in her elegant executive ensemble, Blake having already removed his jacket and rolled up his shirt sleeves. "The next phase will be the most challenging," Alexandra explained, stirring her coffee. "We need to turn your tacit knowledge into a replicable training program. That means you'll have to work closely with our development team." Blake frowned. "But what about my job as a paramedic? We can work something out with the emergency department. Half time in the ambulance, half time on the project." She hesitated before continuing. "I know it's a lot to ask, but it's not that," Blake interrupted softly. "It's that directly saving lives, being there at the critical moment, that's part of who I am." Alexandra reached across the table, lightly touching his arm. "And that's exactly why this project needs you. Every paramedic we train will be an extension of your work, multiplying your impact exponentially. Her touch sent an electric current through Blake's arm, something he tried to ignore. Over the last few weeks, working with Alexandra had been a roller coaster of emotions that he wasn't prepared to process. "All right," he finally agreed, "but on one condition. I want to keep at least 2 shifts a week on the ambulance." "Done," Alexandra smiled, and Blake realized he was already getting used to that smile, lighting up her green eyes. The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. An entire team was assigned to the project, taking up an entire floor of the Sterling building. Blake found himself immersed in a world of flowcharts, presentations, and endless meetings, always with Alexandra as his anchor, translating her practical knowledge into corporate language. One evening, after a particularly intense program development session, they were the only ones left in the office. Alexandra was at her desk, surrounded by documents, when Blake noticed her discreetly massaging her ribs. "Does it still hurt?" he asked, moving closer. "Only when I breathe," she tried to joke, but her expression betrayed her discomfort. "May I?" Blake asked, his paramedic instincts taking over. Alexandra nodded, and he gently guided her to sit up straighter, his experienced hands identifying the points of tension. "You need more rest," he murmured, aware of the closeness between them. "The body needs time to heal completely." "Time is a luxury in my world," Alexandra replied softly, but didn't move away from his touch. The moment was interrupted by Blake's cell phone. A message from Monica asking if he would be working the next morning. "I should go," he said, taking a step back. "Early shift tomorrow." Alexandra nodded, pulling herself together. "And Blake?" "Thank you, Blake, for trusting me with all this." As he drove home that evening, Blake reflected on how his life had changed in just a few weeks. The protocol he had developed in solitude for years was about to become something much bigger than himself. And Alexandra? Well, she was a complication he hadn't foreseen. On the other side of the city, Alexandra stood in her office, looking out of the window at the lights of Boston. In her mind, numbers and strategies danced alongside the memory of Blake's gentle touch. She had built her career on being relentlessly focused, never allowing emotions to interfere with professional decisions. But something was changing, and for the first time in a long time, she didn't have a plan to deal with it. The Turner Protocol pilot program was about to begin at Boston Medical Center. Blake watched through the glass of the training room as 20 paramedics settled into their chairs. His hands were sweating. Teaching had never been part of his career plans. "Nervous?" Alexander asked, appearing beside him with 2 cups of coffee. Over the last few weeks, she had learned how he took his coffee, black with a hint of cinnamon. "It's different when you're just saving lives," he replied, accepting the coffee. "There's no time to think too much. But this," he gestured towards the living room, "that's exposing my soul for judgment." Alexander smiled, unconsciously adjusting Blake's crooked tie, a gesture that had become natural between them. "Your soul has already saved hundreds of lives. Now it's time to multiply that impact." The training session began with Alexandra introducing the project. Her presence naturally commanded the room, but when she passed the floor to Blake, something unexpected happened. His initial nervousness turned into pure passion as soon as she started talking about real cases. "I'm not here to tell you that you're doing something wrong," Blake explained, his voice gaining confidence. "I'm here because after 7 years on the streets, I've learned that sometimes you have to think outside the box to keep someone alive for a few more crucial minutes." Monica, who was among the participants, smiled proudly. She had been one of the first to support the documentation of the protocol. During the break, Alexandra received an urgent call and left the room. Blake watched her through the glass, noticing how she gestured while talking on the phone. Over the last few days, he had begun to recognize her little habits. How she played with her necklace when she was concentrating, how her eyes lit up when she was solving a complex problem. "So," Monica approached with a suggestive smile. "You and the CEO?" "There's no such thing as me and the CEO," Blake quickly cut in. "It's strictly professional." "Of course," Monica laughed. "That's why you can't take your eyes off her when she's around." Blake was about to retort when Alexandra returned, her expression worried. "We need to talk," she said quietly. In private, in the makeshift office adjacent to the training room, Alexandra closed the door. "I've just had a call from the board. There's a group of investors questioning the investment in the project. They want faster results. Faster? We're already running out of time, Blake protested. I know, Alexander sighed, running her hand through her hair in a rare gesture of frustration. They suggest simplifying the protocol, making it more commercial. Simplify? Blake felt his stomach turn. Alexandra, every detail of this protocol was developed with blood and sweat. Literally. We can't simplify something that deals with human lives. I agree, she said, stepping closer, and I'll fight for it. But I need you to trust me. Their gazes met, and for a moment the air between them seemed charged with electricity. Blake realized he was too close. He could smell her soft perfume, see the little freckles that dotted her nose. I trust, he said softly, and was surprised to realize that it was true. In just a few weeks, Alexandra had become more than a project partner. She was someone he trusted implicitly. The moment was interrupted by a knock on the door. It was time to resume training. In the evening, after everyone had left, Blake found Alexandra still at her desk, surrounded by spreadsheets and projections. You need to rest, he said, leaning against the doorframe. I need to find a way to prove that this project is worth every penny, she replied without raising her eyes. Blake approached, taking a seat in the chair opposite the desk. Do you know what changed my mind about sharing the protocol? Alexander finally looked at him, curious. It was you, he admitted. Not just because you survived, but because you immediately understood that this was bigger than both of us. You saw the potential when I was too busy being afraid to expose my work. Blake, investors will see it too, he continued. Maybe not today or tomorrow, but they will, because you have a gift for making people see what's really important. Alexander smiled, and for the first time that day, her shoulders relaxed. Thank you. Sometimes it's easy to get lost in the numbers and forget why we started this. Why don't we have dinner? Blake suggested impulsively. You need to eat, and I know a great place nearby. Alexandra hesitated for a moment, and Blake immediately regretted the suggestion. Of course, she wouldn't want to have dinner with him. They were from different worlds, after all. I'd love to, she replied, surprising him. Just give me 5 minutes to organize it here. Dinner was at a small Italian restaurant, far from the corporate circuit that Alexandra usually frequented. Between plates of homemade pasta and red wine, the lines between professional and personal began to blur. How did you get to be CEO so young? Blake asked, genuinely curious. Alexandra swirled the wine in her glass thoughtfully. My father died suddenly. I was the only heir, and I had two choices: sell the company or take over. I chose to fight for his legacy. The vulnerability in her voice touched Blake deeply. He was beginning to see beyond the powerful CEO, discovering the woman who carried the weight of so many responsibilities with grace and determination. What neither of them realized was that that dinner would mark the beginning of a subtle change in their dynamic. A change that would make the development of the Turner Protocol even more complex, mixing professional goals with feelings that were increasingly difficult to ignore. The conference room at the Hyatt Regency was packed for the presentation of the preliminary results of the Turner Protocol. 3 months of intensive testing had produced data that surpassed even Alexandra's most optimistic projections. Blake nervously adjusted his new suit, this time bought especially for the occasion, no longer borrowed. Breathe, Alexandra whispered, discreetly touching his arm. You know those numbers better than anyone. Before Blake could respond, Richard Keller, the CFO, took to the stage to make the introduction. The audience was packed with healthcare executives, hospital directors, and representatives from competing pharmaceutical companies. Numbers are impressive, Richard began, but today we're going to go beyond statistics. Let's talk about lives saved. Blake watched Alexandra take the stage with her usual grace. Over the last few weeks, he had become acutely aware of her every move, the way she gestured when she spoke, the sparkle in her eyes when she was excited about something. The Turner Protocol is not just a medical innovation, Alexandra began, her voice clear and confident. It's a revolution in the way we approach medical emergencies. The presentation proceeded with surgical precision. Alexandra and Blake alternated on stage, their presentations complementing each other perfectly. She with the data and strategies, he with the practical experiences in real cases. It was a well-rehearsed dance that they had perfected over the months. In just 12 weeks, Alexander revealed, we record a 31% reduction in mortality in critical cases where the protocol was applied. This exceeds our initial projections by 4%. A buzz went through the room. Blake noticed several executives leaning over their notes, whispering among themselves. That's when the first difficult question arose. How can we be sure that these results aren't just a statistical coincidence? Asked a hospital director from Chicago. Blake felt his heart race, but before he could answer, Alexandra intervened with a series of correlated data she had prepared in anticipation of exactly this type of questioning. Her defense was impeccable, based on solid evidence and rigorous scientific methodology. After the presentation, during the cocktail party, Blake watched Alexandra skillfully navigate between executives and potential investors. She was in her element, turning skeptics into allies with a precise blend of charm and technical competence. Impressive, isn't it? Monica appeared beside him, pouring herself champagne. She had been promoted to training coordinator for the program. The way she defends her work as if it were her own. It's our job now, Blake corrected softly, his eyes still fixed on Alexandra. Are you sure it's just the job you're watching so closely? Monica teased with a knowing smile. Before Blake could retort, Alexandra beckoned him closer. A group of investors wanted to hear more technical details directly from the source. The evening progressed with successive rounds of talks and negotiations. Around 10, as the event began to wind down, Alexandra found Blake on the hotel balcony, watching the lights of Boston. We need to celebrate, she declared, joining him in the evening view. We got 3 new strategic partners today. Alexandra, Blake began hesitantly. There's something I need to tell you. She turned to him, noticing the seriousness in his voice. What is it? I received an offer from Johns Hopkins. They want me to lead the implementation of the protocol there. In Baltimore. The silence that followed was heavy. Alexandra felt something tighten in her chest, a sensation that had nothing to do with her still recovering ribs. It's an incredible opportunity, she finally said, her professional voice masking the turmoil inside. When do you decide? I have until the end of the week, Blake replied, studying her reaction. But I'm not going to accept. Alexandra blinked, surprised. Why not? It's Johns Hopkins, Blake. It would be perfect for expanding the protocol. Because the work here isn't finished, he said, turning to face her fully. Because we make an incredible team. Because he hesitated, weighing up his next words. Because there are reasons why I want to stay in Boston. The air between them seemed charged with electricity. Alexandra felt her heart race, recognizing the crucial moment that lay ahead. What would those reasons be? She asked softly, taking a step towards him. The moment was interrupted by Alexandra's cell phone, an emergency at the factory that required her immediate attention. The reality of their different worlds once again imposing itself. I'm sorry, she muttered, already back in CO mode. I need to sort this out. Blake nodded, understanding. Go on, we'll talk later. Watching Alexandra walk away quickly, phone in hand, Blake reflected on how their lives had intertwined in unexpected ways. The protocol that had begun as a solitary note was turning into something much bigger, and Alexandra was an integral part of that transformation. Monica was right. It wasn't just work that kept him in Boston, but how to balance his growing feelings with the complexity of their professional partnership. How to risk everything they had built for something that could complicate the project of their lives. The Boston night offered more questions than answers as Blake stood on the balcony, feeling the weight of decisions that would go far beyond his professional career. The Johns Hopkins proposal weighed heavily on Blake's mind as he went about his regular shift in the ambulance. It was a busy morning in Boston, and he was grateful for the distraction of emergency calls. Monica, by his side, maintained an understanding silence, understanding that her partner needed space to think. A particularly intense call led them to an accident in Dorchester. As Blake applied the protocol to a trauma victim, his mind inevitably went back to Alexandra. The very procedure he was now using, which had saved her life months ago, had turned into something much bigger thanks to his vision and determination. Hey, Tara calling Blake, Monica interrupted her thoughts as they headed back to base. You still haven't told me what your decision was about Baltimore. Blake sighed, parking the ambulance. How can I leave all this behind? The protocol is still in the early stages of implementation here in Boston. Are you sure it's just a protocol you don't want to leave behind? Monica asked, arching an eyebrow. Before Blake could answer, his phone vibrated. A message from Alexandra asking to meet him urgently at her office. The tone of the message sounded worried. 40 minutes later, Blake walked into the Sterling Pharmaceuticals office, still in his paramedic uniform. He found Alexandra in a tense video conference, her fingers drumming nervously on the desk, a habit he had learned to recognize as a sign of stress. When she finally hung up, her expression was grave. We have a problem. A group of investors is pushing for significant changes to the protocol. They want to simplify the process to make it more commercially viable. Simplify. Blake felt his stomach turn. Alexandra, every element of the protocol exists for a reason. Removing any part of it could compromise the whole process. I know, she replied, getting up to pour 2 cups of coffee. And I completely agree, but they're threatening to withdraw funding if we don't make some concessions. Blake accepted the coffee she offered, his fingers brushing briefly against hers. How long do we have? Board meeting next week. We need to come up with a solution by then. Alexandra hesitated before continuing. Maybe the Johns Hopkins proposal isn't such a bad idea. It would be an independent validation of the protocol. It could give us more leverage in the negotiations. You wanted to go to Baltimore? Blake asked, surprised. No, Alexandra answered quickly, then corrected herself. I mean, professionally it would make sense, but the silence that followed was laden with unspoken words. Blake watched Alexandra walk around her desk, stopping by the window that offered a panoramic view of Boston. Do you know why I chose not to sell the company when my father died? She asked suddenly. Because he always said that our work wasn't about profit, it was about making a difference in people's lives. Your protocol is exactly the kind of difference he stood for. Blake approached, stopping next to her. Alexandra, I can't ask you to stay, she continued, turning to face him. It would be selfish of me. Johns Hopkins would offer more resources, more visibility for the protocol. What if I wanted to stay? Blake asked softly. Not for the protocol, not for the company. The moment was interrupted by a knock on the door. Dr. Chen entered carrying a folder of results. Sorry to interrupt, but you need to see this. The data Dr. Chen presented was impressive. The cases treated with the Turner protocol showed an even higher recovery rate than the preliminary results had indicated. More importantly, the patients had fewer post-trauma complications. This is exactly what we needed, Alexandra exclaimed, her mind already formulating strategies. With these numbers, we can justify keeping the protocol intact. There's more, Dr. Chen continued. 3 other hospitals in the region have expressed an interest in implementing the protocol. They've seen the results and want to be part of the pilot program. Blake watched Alexandra work, instantly transforming raw data into convincing arguments. It was fascinating to see how she managed to balance business vision with genuine concern for the human impact of her decisions. After Dr. Chen left, Alexandra turned to Blake, her eyes shining with renewed determination. I'm not going to let them simplify your work. We're going to fight for it the right way. Together? Blake asked, holding out his hand to her. Alexandra entwined her fingers in his, the gesture carrying a meaning that went beyond professional partnership. Together. At that moment, Blake knew that his decision about Baltimore had already been made. He had built something special in Boston, not just protocol, but connections that transcended the professional. Monica was right. It wasn't just the work that kept him there. I'll call Johns Hopkins tomorrow, he said. Thank them for the offer, but explain that my work here isn't finished. Alexandra's smile lit up her whole face. Are you sure? Absolutely, Blake replied, realizing that he had never been so sure of a decision in his life. The rest of the afternoon was spent preparing the strategy for the board meeting. As they worked side by side, sharing ideas and building arguments, it became increasingly clear that what was growing between them was just as important as the protocol they were defending. And so, in an office high above Boston, 2 people from different worlds continued their shared journey, building something that could not only save lives, but also transform their own in ways they had never imagined. News of Blake's decision to turn down Johns Hopkins offer circulated quickly around Sterling Pharmaceuticals. The looks he received as he walked through the corridors ranged from admiration to curiosity, especially when he was near Alexandra. Rumors about the nature of their relationship were beginning to spread, adding an extra layer of pressure to the already delicate situation with the board. One particularly tense afternoon, while they were revising the final presentation for the board meeting, Monica had turned up unexpectedly in Alexander's office. "Sorry to interrupt," she said, her normally relaxed face serious. "But we have a situation at the General Hospital. One of the teams applied the protocol to a complicated case and, well, it didn't end well." Blake's blood ran cold. It was the first case of significant failure since the start of the pilot program. Alexandra immediately closed her laptop. "Details," she demanded, while Blake was already reaching for his coat. 16-year-old girl, car accident. The team followed protocol, but there were complications they couldn't foresee. She's in critical condition. On the way to the hospital, in Alexander's car, the silence was heavy. Blake mentally reviewed every aspect of the protocol, looking for possible flaws that could have contributed to the incident. "It's not your fault," Alexander said softly, as if reading his thoughts. "Even the best protocol in the world can't save every life." "But what if the investors are right?" Blake asked, his voice trembling. "What if trying to maintain the complexity of the protocol is costing lives instead of saving them?" Alexander parked the car at the hospital and turned to him. "Blake, look at me. One case doesn't invalidate months of positive results. We need to understand what happened before jumping to conclusions." At the hospital, they found the paramedic team still shaken. Sam Peterson, the paramedic who had led the response, was sitting in a chair in the break room, still in his blood-stained uniform. "I'm sorry, Blake," he said as soon as he saw them. "I followed every step, but tell me exactly what happened," Blake asked, taking a seat next to him. While Sam recounted the details of his service, Alexandra watched the interaction, impressed by Blake's ability to be both professional and compassionate. He listened attentively, asking pertinent questions, but also offering emotional support to his clearly devastated colleague. After an hour of detailed analysis, it became clear that it hadn't been a protocol failure, but a pre-existing medical complication that the patient had and which wasn't apparent at the time of care. "You did everything right," Blake assured Sam. "The protocol worked exactly as it should have, keeping her alive until she got to hospital. What happened next was beyond our control." On the way back to the office, Alexander noticed that Blake was still tense. "Would you like some dinner? I know a quiet place where we can talk." They ended up in a small restaurant on Beacon Hill, away from the corporate circuit. Between plates of comfort food and a bottle of red wine, the tension began to ease. "How do you cope?" Blake finally asked. "With the weight of decisions that affect so many lives?" Alexandra swirled the wine in her glass thoughtfully. "I learned from my father that leadership isn't about having all the answers, but about asking the right questions and trusting the right people." "And you trust me?" The words came out before Blake could contain them. "More than I should, probably," she replied with a small smile. "Enough to risk my position on the board defending your protocol." The moment was interrupted by Alexander's phone. It was Dr. Chun with an update. The patient had stabilized after emergency surgery. "See?" Alexander smiled, putting the phone away. "Your protocol gave her enough time to get the help she needed. That's what we'll try to make the council understand." Blake reached across the table, lightly touching her fingers. "Thank you for believing in me in protocol. In us," Alexandra added softly, entwining her fingers in his. The touch was electrifying, full of unexplored possibilities. But before either of them could say more, Blake's cell phone rang. It was time for his shift in the ambulance. "Go," Alexander said, understanding the importance of her job. But this conversation isn't over. On the way to the paramedic base, Blake reflected on how his life had changed over the last few months. The protocol that had begun as a solitary project had become something much bigger, and Alexandra, well, she had become much more than a business partner. Monica was waiting in the ambulance when he arrived. "So," she teased, "romantic dinner with the CEO?" "It wasn't romantic," Blake protested, but his smile betrayed him. "Of course not," Monica laughed. "That's why you're practically floating." Before Blake could reply, The radio announced an emergency. As they rushed to yet another call, he thought about how his life now seemed divided into two worlds that were beginning to blend together in unexpected ways. And, surprisingly, he didn't want it to be any different. The Sterling Pharmaceuticals board meeting was scheduled for the following morning, but an unexpected crisis threatened to derail everything. A leak to the press about the case of the teenage girl at General Hospital had generated sensationalist headlines questioning the safety of the Turner Protocol. Alexandra stared at the notifications on her phone as she ate her third breakfast. The Boston Globe had published a particularly damaging story. Experimental protocol puts lives at risk. We need a containment strategy, Richard Keller, the CFO, insisted during an emergency video conference. Investors are nervous. The stock fell 3% this morning alone. Let's not panic, Alexandra replied firmly. The protocol has solid data backing up its effectiveness. One isolated case won't change that. As the discussion unfolded, Blake was on his own battlefield. A news crew had surrounded the entrance to the paramedics' base, trying to extract sensationalist statements from the professionals. How do you feel knowing that your protocol may have contributed to worsening the condition of a teenage girl? A reporter asked, shoving a microphone in her face. Monica quickly intervened, placing herself between Blake and the reporter. No comment. And I suggest you check your facts before making unfounded accusations. Inside the base, Sam Peterson was devastated. The patient had stabilized, but the media was completely distorting the facts of the case. Maybe I should make a statement, Sam suggested. Explain exactly what happened. No, Blake replied, putting a hand on his shoulder. Let Sterling's press office deal with it. Our job is to save lives, not to feed headlines. His phone vibrated, a message from Alexandra. Emergency meeting. My office. 30 minutes. When Blake arrived at Sterling Pharmaceuticals, he found not only Alexandra, but a room full of executives, lawyers, and public relations specialists. The contrast between his paramedic uniform and the impeccable suits around him had never seemed so stark. Protocol works, Alexandra declared, her voice cutting through the buzz in the room. And we have the data to prove it. Blake, I need you to help us translate these numbers into real stories, concrete cases that demonstrate the positive impact. For the next 2 hours, Blake detailed case after case of lives saved thanks to the protocol. Alexandra watched with admiration as he transformed statistics into powerful human narratives, giving faces and names to the numbers that underpinned his work. We also have letters of support from 3 of the main hospitals on the East Coast, Alexandra added, including Johns Hopkins. Blake looked at her, surprised. He hadn't known that she had kept in touch with the hospital after his refusal. Sometimes, she whispered as the others began to disperse, it's important to keep all the bridges intact. They were alone in the office, the afternoon sun painting golden shadows through the windows. Alexandra looked exhausted, but she still had that steely determination that Blake admired so much. How do you do it? He asked softly. Keep calm when everything seems to be falling apart? Alexandra smiled, a tired but genuine smile. Years of practice. And she hesitated for a moment. Having the right people by my side helps. The moment was interrupted by a knock on the door. Dr. Chen entered with urgent news. The teenager's family wanted to talk to them. They don't want to sue, Dr. Chen explained. In fact, they want to thank you. Protocol is what kept their daughter alive long enough to get to surgery. They're willing to make a public statement. Alexandra and Blake exchanged hopeful glances. It was exactly what they needed to counteract the negative media coverage. Organize a press conference for tomorrow. Before the board meeting, Alexandra instructed her PR team. But first, I want to meet this family in person. No cameras, no press. At the hospital, Ellen Martinez, the teenager's mother, tearfully hugged Blake. The doctor explained to us that if it hadn't been for his protocol, for those first crucial minutes of care, our Jessica wouldn't have made it to hospital alive. Alexandra watched the scene from a distance, her heart squeezing. She saw in Blake not only the dedicated professional, but the man who cared deeply about every life he touched. Later, as they walked through the hospital parking lot, Alexandra held Blake's hand. The gesture was as much a search for comfort as an offer of support. Tomorrow is going to be a decisive day, she said. The council, "The press, we're ready," Blake replied, squeezing her hand gently. "And even if we weren't, some things are worth the fight." Alexander stopped, turning to face him. The parking lot lights created a soft halo around her, and for the first time that chaotic day, she allowed herself a moment of vulnerability. "Blake, The sound of an ambulance cut through the moment, its lights reflecting off the parked cars. Blake recognized the code. "Serious emergency." "Go," Alexander said, releasing his hand. "I know you need to go." "Tomorrow," he promised, already running towards the base. "We'll finish this conversation tomorrow." Alexandra watched him go, feeling the weight of the battle that awaited them the next morning. But now she knew one thing for sure. Some fights aren't just professional, and some protocols go far beyond medical procedures. The morning of the council meeting dawned with an electric energy in the air. Alexandra adjusted her navy blazer as she watched the Martinez family prepare for the press conference. Ellen Martinez, still emotionally shaken but determined, held up a photo of her daughter Jessica, smiling in her hospital bed. "Are you sure you want to do this?" Alexandra asked gently. "No one will judge if you prefer privacy right now. My daughter is alive thanks to the Turner Protocol," Ellen replied firmly. "The world needs to know that." Blake arrived moments before the press conference began, still wearing his uniform after a particularly intense night shift. His eyes met Alexander's across the crowded room of journalists, and a silent communication passed between them. Strength, confidence, something else that neither of them was ready to name. The press conference was a smashing success. Ellen Martinez spoke eloquently about how the protocol had been crucial in saving her daughter. Dr. Chin presented medical data proving the effectiveness of the method, and other health professionals shared positive experiences. "The Turner Protocol is not just a set of procedures," Alexander concluded for the cameras. "It's the result of years of practical experience, dedication, and a deep commitment to preserving human life." As the journalists dispersed, Richard Keller approached the group with urgent news. "The major shareholders are demanding a private meeting before the board." Now, Alexander felt her stomach turn. Last-minute meetings rarely brought good news. "Blake, I need you to come with me." In the conference room on the 40th floor, they met Howard Sterling, Alexander's uncle and the company's main shareholder, along with other important investors. The atmosphere was tense. "Alexandra," Howard began, his voice calculatedly neutral, "we've received an interesting proposal from MedTech Industries. They want to buy the rights to the Turner Protocol. The offer is substantial." Blake felt Alexandra stiffen beside him. MedTech was known for simplifying medical procedures to maximize profits. "How much?" Alexander asked, her professional voice masking the turmoil inside. Howard slid a piece of paper across the table. The figure made Blake hold his breath. It was more money than he could make in several lifetimes. "On one condition," Howard continued. "They want full control over the development and implementation of the protocol. No interference from Sterling," or he looked at Blake, the original creator. The silence that followed was deafening. Alexander looked at Blake, seeing in him not just the dedicated paramedic who had saved her life, but the man who had become essential to her existence in ways that transcended the professional. "No," she said firmly, handing the paper back without even looking at him again. "Alexandra," Howard sighed, "be reasonable. The company was built on the principle of saving lives, not maximizing profits at any cost," she interrupted. "Dad would never accept that, and you know it." "Your father is no longer here," Howard retorted harshly. "And sometimes we have to make difficult decisions for the shareholders." "The shareholders?" Alexander stood up, her voice shaking with restrained emotion. "What about the patients? The families? The people like Jessica Martinez who are alive today thanks to this protocol in its original form?" Blake watched the exchange, admiring Alexander's strength. She was risking everything, her position, her family legacy, to stand up for something she believed in. "If I may," he interjected, surprising everyone, "the protocol is not just a product to be sold. It's a living system that continues to evolve based on real experiences, on unique cases. Simplifying it would be like ripping out its soul." Howard studied Blake for a moment before turning to Alexandra. "The board will vote in an hour. I hope you know what you're doing." When they were alone in the room, Alexandra finally allowed her defenses to drop. "I'm sorry about that," she muttered. "You shouldn't have to put yourself under that kind of pressure." Blake approached, gently touching her face. "Hey, we're in this together, remember?" The moment was interrupted by Blake's phone. Monica needed him urgently at the base. A critical situation had arisen. "Go," Alexander said, recognizing the importance of the call. "I'll deal with the council." "Alexandra," Blake hesitated in the doorway. "Regardless of what happens today, thank you for believing in protocol, for believing in me." She smiled that smile that made his heart race. "Some things are more important than money or power, Blake. Some people are more important." As he rushed to attend to yet another emergency, Blake knew that their lives had changed irrevocably. The protocol that had brought them together was about to define not only the future of emergency medicine, but also the fate of two hearts that had found in each other much more than a professional partnership. The Sterling Pharmaceuticals boardroom was as silent as an ICU at night. Alexander stood before the board members, her firm posture masking the inner storm that was consuming her. The last 24 hours had been a roller coaster of emotions culminating in this decisive moment. "Gentlemen," she began, her voice clear and determined, "we are here to vote not just on a medical protocol, but on the future of countless lives. MedTech Industries' proposal is tempting financially, but it represents everything Sterling Pharmaceuticals has never been." At the paramedic base, Blake was attending to his last emergency of the shift, an elderly man with a heart attack. As he applied the protocol, his mind was divided between the patient and the meeting taking place on the other side of town. Monica watched her partner with concern, noticing the tension in his shoulders. "The Turner Protocol is not just a set of procedures," Alexander continued in the boardroom, echoing her words from the press conference. "It's the result of years of experience, of sleepless nights, of lives saved and, yes, some lost. It's a living system that keeps evolving, adapting, improving." Howard Sterling shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Alexandra, no one is questioning the effectiveness of the protocol. The issue is purely commercial. MedTech has offered money," Alexandra interrupted, her green eyes sparkling. "But how much is one life worth? What are all the Jessicas Martinez who haven't needed the protocol yet, but will?" At the hospital, Blake handed the patient over to the emergency team. Dr. Chun was on duty and immediately noticed the paramedic's distraction. "She'll make it," Dr. Chun said softly. "Alexandra Sterling isn't known for losing important battles." Blake nodded, checking his phone for the 10th time in an hour. No message yet. Back in the boardroom, Alexandra was projecting the latest data she had collected. "In the last 6 months, we've recorded a 42% increase in the survival rate in critical cases where the protocol has been applied. These aren't just numbers. These are fathers who have returned to their families, children who will grow up with their mothers, lives that continue." Richard Keller, who until then had remained silent, snorted. "What about the creator of the protocol? Blake Turner turned down a position at Johns Hopkins to stay here. What's his real motivation, Alexandra?" The silence that followed was heavy with innuendo. Alexandra felt her heart racing, but kept her composure. "Blake Turner is an exceptional professional who has chosen to remain where his work can have the greatest possible impact," she replied, deliberately ignoring the subtext of the question. "His dedication to protocol and to his patients is inspiring." Meanwhile, Blake arrived at Sterling Pharmaceuticals still in his uniform. The lobby was buzzing with reporters waiting for the outcome of the meeting. Monica had insisted that he go, arguing that he belonged there. On the 40th floor, Alexandra was preparing for the final vote when the door to the boardroom opened. Blake entered, still carrying the weight of his last meeting, the stark reality of fieldwork in stark contrast to the corporate environment. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who intimately knows the value of every second in an emergency. "Before you vote, I'd like to share something." Alexandra watched, surprised but proud, as Blake recounted the service he had just performed. He described how the protocol had been fundamental in stabilizing the patient, how every element of the procedure worked in harmony to maintain a life. "This protocol is not my property," Blake concluded. "It belongs to every paramedic who applies it, every patient it saves, every family that welcomes their loved one back. To simplify for profit would be to betray its essence. Howard Sterling studied Blake for a long moment before turning to Alexandra. "Do you really believe we can make this work our way?" "I believe it's the only way to make it work," she replied with conviction. The vote that followed was tense. When the last vote was counted, Alexandra finally allowed herself to breathe. The board had decided by a narrow margin to keep the protocol under the control of Sterling Pharmaceuticals in its original form. Hours later, when the building was practically empty, Alexandra found Blake on the balcony of his office, watching the lights of Boston. "Thank you for coming today," she said, joining him in the evening view. "Your presence made a difference." "I couldn't let you fight this battle alone," he replied, turning to face her. "Not after everything you risked for protocol. For us." The us hung in the air between them, loaded with meaning. Alexandra took a step towards him, eliminating the professional distance they had kept for so long. "You know," she said softly, "when you saved me in that accident, I never imagined you'd be saving so much more than my life." Blake touched her face gently, years of restraint dissolving in that moment. Sometimes the best protocols are the ones we don't plan. When their lips finally met, it was as if all the chaos of the last few months made sense. Two different worlds, united by a common purpose, finding something even more precious in the process. Blake's phone vibrated, another emergency call. They parted, smiling at the familiarity of the interruption. "Go," Alexandra said, her smile lighting up the night. "Save one more life. I'll be here when you get back." As Blake rushed off for another appointment, he carried with him the certainty that some protocols transcend medicine. Love, after all, has its own rhythm, its own procedures, and sometimes all we need to do is trust the process and let the heart do its work.